After e4, e6, d4, d5, knight c3, and now black plays bishop b4. Now the move is e5, as we saw in the previous videos. The idea is to block the center. Now the c5 is the next move by black, and now we attack the bishop. So in the previous video we went through what happens after bishop a5, and then just as many lines as we possibly could with all the ideas in scenario. In this video we're going to go through the all swap variation. Bishop takes knight. Well, of course we have to take back, and now well, there's plenty of things that can happen now. Queen c7, knight c6, knight e7, all sorts of stuff. But right now we're going to start the video with this pawn takes. So we take back with the pawn and we keep this center. The idea that black player might have is to make the c pawn a backward pawn and eventually target it in the future. But anyway, this is not supposed to be very good because black just gave us the bishop for the knight, and this is not going to be a great bishop. So what to do now? Well, black has to move, and his next move is potentially queen c7. The idea is to go to c3 with a check, and then he's going to threaten the rook. We're going to have to block the check. So let's say, for example, bishop here, bishop to d2, blocking the check, and then black will be able to win a pawn. And so that's really bad. It's a central pawn. So we don't have any reason to lose it. So after queen c7, the move now is bishop to d2. It doesn't look very good, but it's actually just fine because it's not blocking our queen, as the queen will be developed in this type of, in the Winawer defense. The vast majority of times the queen will develop straight into g4, attacking the g7 square, since the dark square bishop has departed at the very beginning of the game, and there's a weakness on there could be a weakness in the dark squares, and we're going to target g7. So bishop d2 stops the queen from going down, and now black will have to continue development. We're going to start by this move, knight e7. The next move now is a very, very logical bishop d3. The idea is that since we have a pawn in e5 which attacks the f6 and d6 squares, the black knight in this case will not be able to go to the f6 square, meaning that the control of the h7 square will be weaker, and so the white bishop will be threatening, really threatening, when the black king will castle. And so after this move, black castles. Now, we cannot do the Greek gift, right? If we had the knight in f3, we could think of doing it, but right now we don't have it. But in this specific variation, when somebody plays the Winawer, the all swaps variation of the Winawer with all the pawn takes and so on, with the queen c7 and the knight e7. Now let's look at all the ways to attack that king. So right now the move is this, queen h5. White is already going for it. This is a threat of checkmate. So there's plenty of ways to block it. Let's look at them one by one. So let's look at knight g6 first, right? So this is stopping the checkmate for the moment. White continues with knight f3. What can black do? Black doesn't want to push the pawns in front of his own king because it's just gonna make white's life easier. So after a move like knight c6, black is developing a knight. White will just castle. This is how the setup is looking like at the moment. Black's move, knight to c6, makes sense not only to developing a piece, but the idea is to go to e7 and eventually f5 and try to bring as many pieces as possible near the king side and potentially neutralize the attack of the white player and maybe try to punish him for using the queen so early in the game, but everything is under control. After white castle and black plays a move like knight c to e7, white will play this move, h4. The idea potentially is to just move the queen to g5 and keep pushing the pawn and remove the knight, one of the defenders of the opponent king, and then keep storming pawn against the opponent king side and try to swap as much stuff as possible so we can infiltrate with our powerful pieces. Let's look at one of the many ideas that black can, well, we're going to look at several ideas, but let's start by pawn to f5. This move here makes sense. It's literally stopping the influence of one of our bishops, one of the attackers to the h7 square, and try to create some space for the black players to start breathing. So in this case we can take the pawn. Pawn takes en passant. After rook takes, everything seems to be alright, but now white continues with bishop to g5, attacking the rook. The rook will have to move. The only square where the rook isn't taken would be f7 or f8. After rook to f8, for example, white can make use of his two very good bishops and start creating a little bit of damage in the opponent king side. So now the move is bishop takes e7. Of course, the knight cannot take back, simply because of bishop h7 check. King has to move, and then bishop goes back here, and then there's going to be checkmate next move. So that's not possible. So going back a move, after bishop takes here. What happens after queen takes back? Then simply knight g5 is threatening a checkmate in h7, and it just cannot be stopped with h6, for example, simply because the queen can take a knight and still threaten checkmate, so the game is over. So let's go back a few moves. After the bishop went to g5 to attack the rook, what happens after rook takes knight? The idea is to remove the opponent knight, which is one of the best pieces that in this specific situation could help white checkmate. So now we just take back with the queen, And after a move like h6, it seems like black is trying to breathe a little bit. Now white goes back to h5 again. It seems like the pawn can just take the bishop, right? And let's say the pawn does take the bishop. Right now, we are going to take back, of course. We had the bishop and we gave it away. Now the knight can just take, and it seems like queen takes back. And, well, we are up the exchange, but it still looked weird that we sacrificed both bishops for 2 knights, but we are simplifying, and in this case that is the best way to continue. And now white's got a very good advantage. Right, back at the previous position after the bishop g5 move. What happens if the rook goes back to f7? Then again we just play bishop takes e7, and the reason why the rook might have gone to f7 was to protect the bishop so that the knight wouldn't have to give up the g7 square and allow the infiltration of the queen and bishop. But after rook takes, then we can play again knight to g5, and it's deadly. Right, back at the starting position, let's just recap. After e5, c5, we attack the bishop with the pawn. Bishop takes knight, we take back. And in this video, we're looking at the all swaps variation where the pawn takes the pawn and then we take back, and the queen goes to c7 now, threatening to go to c3 and win a pawn and go to a much better position. So after bishop d2 now, black has to move. So in order to speed up development, also because black will have to castle this side, black plays knight to e7 and white goes on with bishop d3, right? It's not like we're looking at moves that are like 20 moves away from the beginning of the game. This is literally within move 10, right? I'm not counting them right now, but after castle, queen h5, right? So this is a very strong attack. The plan is to play knight f3 and then move like h4, potentially queen to g5. It's fine to put the queen on a dark square there, and then h5, h6, and so on. So after this move, what happens if black blocks it like this with g6? So earlier we went through knight g6. What happens if black blocks it with the pawn in g6? Well, we go to g5, right? It's fine, we're pinning the pawn, the queen is safe, black doesn't have a bishop on the dark square, so this queen here can just be there sitting forever. So what happens after a move like knight f5, right? This is typical in this position. Well, we don't take it right now, we just develop the knight to f3, because the knight was going to have to be developed anyway, and the knight is defending the d4 square, which is very important. A move like h6 to attack the queen is met by queen f4. We're still putting pressure on the square, meaning that if we were to take this knight with the bishop, then we could take this square for free, and after a move like knight g5, we will have a very strong attack. So after queen f4, what happens after a move like f6, right? So of course these moves don't have to necessarily happen, but you're gonna have to know how to deal with trying to dismantle the opponent's king side. So after black is played, let's say now black wants to develop the rook, and pawn takes, and maybe rook takes, putting more defense on this square. Also f6 makes sense because you want to allow the queen to come to the square and protect pretty much everything around the king. So after a move like that, we play h4. The idea is of course to swap everything in here and make this rook, the queen, and this bishop more effective. One of the ways to create an effective attack is also queen to h2 and threaten queen to h8. Let's say, for example, we're going to go through a move like g5 and also a move like queen to g7 right now. Let's start from g5, right? Let's say black is counting pawns, realizing that there's a quite substantial pawn chain. So let's say, for example, after take, black is thinking, everything is protected, so I'm just attacking the queen and just storming the opponent king side, and I'm not really worrying that much about my king because everything is kind of blockaded around here. If the bishop will take me, I will take back with the pawn, and the queen is ready to go this way anyway. So after a move like that, then we create an effective attack by putting the queen and the rook on the same file. So after queen to g7 now, which stops us from going to h8 and create disaster, white plays g4. g4 attacks the knight and stops the pawn from going down, which is important. The knight will have to move. Well, knight to h6 will not be possible because we'll take it. So after knight to e7, we've got this move. Bishop h7 check. The king will not be able to go to h8 because of a disaster that will happen after pawn takes f6. We're attacking the queen. The queen is not able to take the pawn because of bishop moving back. Then king moves, and then checkmate happening in h7 with the queen. So after rook takes, then we play knight e5 and we're completely winning, threatening to finally infiltrate the bishop to g5 and start creating some deadly attack. Right, so back at the previous position after g4 and knight goes back, now we have the check in h7. What happens after king goes to f7? We've got queen h5. And after knight to g6, white will finally play pawn takes f6, and now we're threatening a check here, which is deadly, and that check is going to happen no matter what. So back a few moves ago, after a move like g5, we take the pawn. What happens if they take our pawn with the f pawn? Then we simply play queen h2 anyway. So now we're threatening knight to g5, right? Because the pawn will not be able to take back as we're infiltrating with the queen, winning the game soon. So that's another idea for this scenario. So going back a few moves again, in this scenario, what happens if black doesn't push the pawns any further, but rather just plays queen g7, sort of just guarding the king? Well, now we can take the knight with the bishop, and now the e pawn takes back. It wouldn't be really nice to take with the g pawn, also because of the threat of rook h3 and then rook to g3. Also, potentially the queen and the bishop might just take this pawn. So after pawn e takes f5, white can take the pawn in h6. After a swap now, the black rook will have to move. So black rook will go to f7 in order not to lose this pawn as well. So after rook to f7, white can now long castle. This king on a dark square just doesn't have to worry about anything. The queens are no longer on the board, so it doesn't really matter when the queens are off the board. It really doesn't matter that you don't castle. I mean, the goal here is to bring this rook into the action. Right, back at the beginning. Let's recap once again so that we can learn it by heart. After e5 and then pawn to c5, we attack the bishop, and in the all swaps variation, bishop takes, pawn takes, pawn takes, takes, and queen c7, we have to proceed with bishop d2. So now we gotta go and play the usual moves. So there's no need to be confused by the order of the moves. Like, let's say, for example, black plays knight c6 instead, right? Then we can immediately play queen g4, as we've seen in the previous video. And also we're trying to familiarize with the patterns here. We're protecting the pawn in 4, we're attacking in g7. But right now we're going through this move, knight e7, because black wants the castle as soon as possible. So bishop d3 and castle. So now the move is queen h5, right? We've seen plenty of scenarios so far. What happens after h6? This seems to be also making sense because it's just stopping the queen from going to checkmate right now. White now plays knight to e2, develops the knight and protects the c3 square whilst we think about crazy attacks like bishop h6. So let's say black plays, I don't know, knight c6. No other move would have been fine. G6, then white would have just taken h6. Knight to g6. Well, it's a similar scenario to the previous one. It wins a pawn for white. White can take the knight, pawn takes back, queen takes back. We're threatening to win the pawn in h6 as well. We're also threatening knight to f4 and knight to h5. So after this knight to c6, let's see, for example, this is a theoretical sacrifice. Bishop takes h6. Right, so now we're threatening to take this pawn as well with an attack on the rook and the infiltration of the queen in h7. If black were to play this move now, then white could even just simply do, I don't know, bishop takes knight and pawn takes, queen takes, pinning the pawn, and white is up 2 pawns and got a better position. If black were to just take the bishop, then we will do queen takes, so we're threatening checkmate here. And how can black stop it? Well, a move like knight to g6 is met by castle, and after knight to e7, potentially just protecting the knight a little bit further, we've got knight to f4. So the idea is to, well, we can't really swap everything because knight takes, and then bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes will allow black to bring the queen here, and then our attack is fading and we will probably lose this game actually. So after this move, we're threatening knight to h5, which is a forced checkmate in 3. The funny thing is that this is unstoppable. The best move now, according to black, according to the engine, is pawn to f5. It is the only move, but it's still white is still completely winning. White takes the pawn en passant and is ready to still play h5 anyway. Rook takes back, and now knight h5. The whole idea of that f5 move was so that black could play rook to f7 and put more defense over the square g7. After rook to f7 though, bishop takes knight takes back, and queen takes back with a check. And now the situation is looking terrible. Well, if black were to block with the rook in g7, and knight f6 would be a checkmate soon. King f8 is met by checkmate in e8. King h8 is met by check in a8, and then rook blocks and then checkmate. So after the check in g6, the king will have to move. After that, we can play a plan that is really slow, but it really proves how bad the position of the black player is and how useless these two pieces are in the attack. White could play this move, rook b1, and the idea of playing rook to b3 and then rook to e3, knight to f6. This plan is really slow, but it's unstoppable. Also, White's king has got nothing to worry at all. So all of this is happening anyway. The g7 square will never be accessible with rook because White will go on the exchange. And after that, there will be a material advantage, a huge material advantage by White. So it will be very easy to continue the game and win. After a move like rook b1, there's nothing really that the black player can do. The black player has no access to c2, neither to c3 after. The rook will be able to go to b3 anyway. White is going to enjoy a very easy endgame.